Okay, so welcome all of you for our lecture today, and this is the last lecture this academic year, and our guest today is Professor Laurent Baggioni from the Université Sorbonne Nouvelle in Paris, and he is an author of a monograph, La forteresse de la raison, lecture de l'humanisme politique florentin d'après l'œuvre de Coluccio Salutati, which was published in Geneva in 2015. So he's a specialist in Italian humanism and Renaissance of the 14th, 15th century. He also authored numerous articles and book chapters about the political thought of the late Middle Ages in Italy. And today, Professor Baggioni will talk about the ancients and moderns in the late Middle Ages in Italy, and the concepts of tyranny and freedom in their writings. So, Professor Baggioni, Laurent, the floor is yours, and I'm sharing the screen immediately so that you could see the presentation.
Thank you.
Okay, can you see the PowerPoint presentation?
Yes, I can. I hope all the participants can.
Okay. So just let me know when to change slides, and I'll do that.
Thank you very much. So good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for your invitation. Thank you for this wonderful series of lectures on tyranny and freedom through the ages. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to attend the previous ones, but I did listen to some of them, and they gave me a lot of new insights. So for my part, I had planned to talk to you about tyranny and freedom in Italy at the end of the Middle Ages, and I had added to my title Ancients and Moderns, because I would like to analyze those concepts and this obsession through the lens of history, the conception of history. So this is an extremely broad subject, and my aim is by no means exhaustive. My horizon, as Matthias just said, is the political thought of the humanists in late 14th and early 15th centuries. And for several years now, I have been trying to assess the innovations made by those writers and thinkers in political thought. And this is why I try to embrace a broader period so as to define and target the original contributions of those thinkers. So just to give you an idea of the authors I will be talking about, I made a list on the second slide. So would you please? So I would deal with those thinkers in the present order. So those thinkers are not presented in a strictly chronological order. So the first is the great jurist Bartolo da Sassoferrato. Second is Petrarch, then Boccaccio, Salutati, and Bruni. So I would like to start by insisting on the fact that we cannot understand properly the idea of tyranny and the obsession between freedom and tyranny if we don't look into the political transformations of late medieval Italy. And as it has been said several times in previous presentations, the categories of freedom and tyranny are marked by a great semantic fluidity. And this polysemy and sometimes this instability is particularly true of 14th century Italy, a period of great political upheaval. So for this short historical presentation, I will rely upon the works of historians, and particularly of historians of politics. And historians have clearly identified two types of political upheaval. Firstly, the transformation of the communes, those city-states, towns governed by elective and collegiate institutions. So the communes evolved into seigneuries, i.e. into authoritarian governments exercised by a single man. This transformation, which was initially reversible, tended to become irreversible. Those lordships were perpetuated over time from one generation to the next, according to a lineage dynamic, with the backing of higher authorities, such as the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy. The most illustrious example is, of course, the Seigneury of Milan, which became a duchy at the end of the 14th century. But this was also the case for the multitude of governments throughout Italy, and particularly in northern Italy: Ferrara, Mantova, Padova, Verona. So this is one particular trend of political transformation, the emergence of seigneuries, lordships. And communes could also evolve into another type of government that historians label as oligarchies. Those governments wouldn't name themselves oligarchies, the term used by historians, but it's widely used, and that's why I also use it myself today. So oligarchies, governments that retained the original elective and collegiate structure of the communes, but whose key councils, key political functions were controlled by a small number of powerful families. And the best known example of this type of oligarchical government being Florence, the Republic of Florence. So this is the first line of political transformation that concerns internal transformation. The other great trend of political mutations concerns the territorial structure of Italy. The peninsular political system evolved towards a plurality of territorial organizations under the aegis of a dominant city. This means that the number of political entities tended to reduce over time, being absorbed into wider political organisms. The most important of them were Venice, the Republic of Venice, Milan, Florence, the Papal States, and the Kingdom of Naples. Those five political entities, I wouldn't dare to call them states, because the word state is slightly anachronical, but they are considered the first states of the Renaissance. These changes have led to profound transformations in government practices. These changes have been accompanied by widespread use of the terms tyrant and tyranny. But what for a long time historians considered that freedom and tyranny corresponded to the opposition between the communal government or the preservation of communal institutions that represented freedom, and the seigneurial transformation that represented tyranny, today it is considered that the extent of the use of the term corresponds rather to changes in practice in all political entities. In other terms, you can find the words liberty and tyranny within different types of political entities. Liberty is not only the privilege of ancient communes, and tyranny is not the situation that is always defined to describe seigneurial governments. So I use here the work of Italian historian Andrea Zorzi, who has proposed a chronology that I reproduced in the following slides, if I'm not mistaken. If I have, yes. So it's just a schematic summary of an important article by Andrea Zorzi, but it shows that the concept of tyranny changed over the Trecento, and we see four phases. The first phase regards the second decade of the 14th century, in which we can observe the eruption of anti-tyrannical controversy due to the granting of titles of imperial vicars. An imperial vicar was a title given by the emperor to some laws that represented the authority of the emperor in Italy. And this granting of titles tended to legitimize the seigneurial evolution of some governments. So the emperor used to have used these types of titles, and as well as the popes. So we had imperial and pontifical vicars that, to certain extent, encouraged the transformation of communes into seigneuries. The second phase, sees a certain change in the use of the concept of tyranny that becomes a militant concept. This is to say, a concept which is used in political internal battles. So tyranny is a weapon that it's used in the, internal political fights. That's why it's called a militant concept. Then in the mid 14th century, we have the composition of very important treatise, De Tyranno, written by one of the most important Italian jurists, Bartolo da Sassoferrato. And the fourth phase, the end of 14th century, is seen as a battle of ideological concepts. Liberty and tyranny are used in an opposition of inside a ideological battle between territorial states. So typically we have the Republic of Florence that defends itself as a government of liberty and accuses its enemy, the Seigneury of Milan, to be a tyranny. And we have the exact opposite, the Duchy of Milan presenting itself as a a government, the free government, and condemning Florentine government as a tyrannical government. So it is just a general, broad outline. I won't go into the details. What is important is that to see that there is an evolution at some time, certain mutations become irreversible, and certain legal synthesis that the work by Bartolo da Sassoferrato give the concept a certain topicality, and the ideological scope is undoubtedly becoming more and more important over time. So I will now say a few words about the most important theoretical contribution on tyranny and also on liberty by Bartolo da Sassoferrato. So his treatise on the tyrant, written between sorry, I have difficulty to translate numbers. I don't know why. It doesn't come to my mind easily. I will write them. So in the middle of the 50s. So this treatise provides numerous conceptual tools for characterizing tyranny. We have between open or manifest tyranny and hidden tyranny. So manifest tyranny happens when there is an usurpation of power or the arbitrary exercise of a legitimately acquired power. And hidden tyranny operates on the basis of apparent constitutional rules or on the basis of an existing office, but the way power is exercised is excessive in relation to the original remit of this office. So this theorization of tyranny is undoubtedly an important sign of the acuity of the political problem of tyranny in Italy in those years. It could even be said that tyranny has become a key factor in Italian political thought over time. It can be found in an extremely large number of sources: legal sources, theoretical or normative, practical sources such as trials, literary sources, epistolary, historiographical, in oratory, in poetry, and other sources. There is a very good synthesis of the importance of tyranny in Italian history and thought of the 14th century. It's called Tyranni e Tirannide nel Trecento Italiano. So tyranny is clearly identified as a government that acts against the law. This theorization was carried out using the instruments of legal science by Bartolo da Sassoferrato, available at that time, but it was also carried out under the aegis of scriptural and patristic authorities. And Bartolo's treatise opens with a long quotation from Gregory the Great, which I'm sure you already know, and you've probably already discussed. Is the third slide of yes, thank you. This excerpt from the Moralia in Job. Proprie enim tyrannus dicitur qui in communi republica non iure principatur. So this opening quotation, it's very interesting, because Bartolo reads this in a specific way. He makes the difference between what is within the competence of the jurist and what is not. So the first part of the quotation is relevant to the authority and the work of the jurist. Sed sciendum est quia omnis superbus juxtamodum proprium tyrannidem exercet, nam quod non nunquam alius in republica, hoc est per acceptam dignitatis potentiam, alius in provincia, alius in civitate, alius in domo propria, alius per, this is the last one, per latentem nequitiam hoc exercet apud se in cogitatione sua. So Bartolo says the first categories fall under the competence of the jurist. The last one is outside, is the competence of the jurist. It leaves the explanation to the theologians. Latentem nequitiam, to this hidden malignity that some people have within themselves, inside themselves. So this is very interesting distinction. I will go back later on that theme. But what is important is that Bartolo wants to draw the limits of juridical action. He wants to define the area of the jurist's competence, and I think it wants to give its full importance to the juridical work he is trying to accomplish. On the other hand, Bartolo formulated a definition or a comprehension of freedom, of liberty. This comprehension was handed down to him by medieval Roman law, which formed the basis of Italian public law in the 14th and 15th century. So libertas had, among other meanings, a technical significance. On the basis, on the fundamental opposition in medieval law, according to which men are aut liberi, aut servi, either free or not free, just slaves. Liberty corresponds to the full decision-making capacity of a political body. So a long institutional history saw the term evolve from the meaning of franchise, a privilege granted by a superior authority. For example, in the case of Florence, the Holy Roman Empire. So an evolution from the meaning of franchise to a more assertive meaning of self-government and independence. And that's the meaning that Bartolo is trying to use, to recognize the effective independence of Italian political entities, either territorial states or city-states. So Bartolo considered free cities and free people to be those that do not recognize a superior. So those, in other terms, those who possess institutions that guarantee self-government and independence. So Bartolo's conceptualization is today hailed as a masterpiece of medieval political thought. And the question is, to what extent was it effectively used by his contemporaries, by political thinkers of his time. And so the question I propose to examine is to what extent this juridical outlook, the juridical point of view was adopted by the humanists. So there is sometimes a tendency to exaggerate the opposition between the humanists and the juridical tradition. And this opposition is very often due to the way the humanists portrayed themselves as students, as followers of ancient authors, more than technical jurists. So many humanists, starting with Petrarch, however, well versed in law, and Petrarch himself had been a pupil of Cino da Pistoia, Bartolo's professor and one of the most important jurists of his time. But I don't want to go into the question of the relation between Petrarch and law, which is a very important question, but rather I wish to emphasize that the very nature of Petrarch's intellectual enterprise is profoundly different from legal theory. But this does not mean that the two are incompatible, that the theoretical, juridical point of view represented by Bartolo is something absolutely incompatible with Petrarch's intellectual views. And I will even say that we can probably consider them as complementary. So in all the histories of humanism, Petrarch is usually given a prominent place as the father of humanism. So I'm not going to deal with the relevance of this presentation today, but I would like to propose a few points for reflection. What we can try to do is to see how the dialectic between ancients and moderns, and between past and present, that is to say for Petrarch, mainly between the Roman past and the Italian present, is operative as a way to analyze contemporary politics. So I am not so much interested in some formulations made by Petrarch as they may appear in some of his letters or invectives. We have, for instance, the letters that accompanied Cola di Rienzo popular revolution in Rome, in which Petrarch expressed his support for the restoration of Roman popular freedom. And then he distanced himself from it when this attempt failed. We have also several paranetic writings, and in particular several epistles that deal with the roles and function of the good prince in the tradition of Specula Principum. And in those texts, Petrarch referred to Roman exempla as to emphasize the importance of the virtues. In those letters or invectives, we sometimes come across specific and peculiar use of the word tyrant or tyranny. And those examples have been often emphasized. This is the, I had written them in the following slide. For instance, in one senilis, pati hominem credo facilius quam tyrannum populum. I think man suffer more from the people than from a tyrant. Or in the invectiva contra quenda magnis statut hominem, nullus tyranni de locus vacat, ubi enim tyranni desunt tyrannizam populi. So there is no place which is free from tyranny. And when the tyrants are absent, the people act as tyrants, populi tyrannizant. So there is this in Petrarch, there's this polemical motive of the people as a tyrant, which is clearly a polemical and paradoxical motive. I don't think these quotations that are very often put forward to illustrate Petrarch's ambivalence towards tyranny, I don't think those instances cannot be considered in themselves without taking in consideration the general frame of Petrarch's thought. So those quotations had been linked to the fact that Petrarch had been in the service of the powerful lords of Milan. His friend Boccaccio, who had offered him a position in the Republican Florence, harshly criticized him for siding with a tyrant, and Petrarch defended himself. And historiography tends to consider that Petrarch had a guilty weakness for authoritarian regimes. That may be true. My aim is not to turn Petrarch into an ardent defender of democracy, but rather to shed light on his thought based on the general frame of his thought. So let's try to have a more broad perspective on his thought and writings. So first point, much of Petrarch's work is historical. He was crowned in Rome in 1341. Poeta. His epic poem, The Africa, and other works, such as the Rerum Memorandarum Libri, fall into the category of historical works. And Petrarch focused primarily on the history of Rome, which he considered to be the maximum degree of political perfection that human organization could achieve. So let us say right away that Petrarchan historical enterprise was not uniform throughout his life. For instance, the De Viris Illustribus was conceived at the beginning as a history of Rome, later included the lives of biblical or legendary figures. Moreover, some of the lives biographies could also use this word, which is slightly anachronical, because the lives that Petrarch writes are not the full account of the full account of all the particular events that constituted the life of a man, but they are extremely selective, and linked to his overall project to depict Roman historian, Roman political mentality, Roman political thinking. So some of the lives composed by Petrarch took on such importance that they went beyond the initial undertaking. This is true of his life of Scipio, who is also the hero of the Africa, his epic poem. It is also, and above all, the case with Caesar, the life of Caesar came to constitute a work in its own right. Secondly, Petrarch exalts the Roman past at the expense of the present. Sometimes even the evocation of Roman greatness serves to devalue contemporary political reality. This is the case, for example, with the analysis of the consulate, the magistracy in Republican Rome. In the life of Scipio, Petrarch compares the power of the consuls with the power of the kings of his time. And he emphasized the greatness of the consuls. The greatness of the Roman consuls can be measured by the scale of their achievements in the relation to the short duration of their office and the obstacle posed by having to share power with another consul. So contemporary kings, despite enjoying better conditions in which to exercise their power, are inferior to Roman consuls. So this is just one example of how Petrarch often uses history, uses the Roman past as a revealing mirror of modern inferiority, of modern political inferiority. In his historical writings, Petrarch presents Roman history as the fruit of human passions, including the love of glory on the positive side. And sometimes there are also negative passions like envy. There is a desire to go back to the Roman political mentality and to evaluate it according to its own criteria, without posing an external judgment and without taking into account the Christian interpretation grid, even if the overall perspective is of course Christian, but Petrarch does not analyze the lives of the great Roman through a religious system of evaluation. We must also underline that the exemplarity of the Roman figures is extremely problematic. And despite the fact that Petrarch firmly believes in the efficacy of historical example, as is expressed in his letters, it is difficult to read the lives of the Veris Illustribus as exhortations to imitate the heroic existence of illustrious men. Petrarch always insists on the human existential dimension and on the limits of his characters for the sake of verisimilitude and credibility. The goal seems to be that of moral meditation. History is a framework for the present, under no circumstances should the present constitute the ground for an imitation of the past. This is my reading. I don't mean to impose it, but I think it sheds light of Petrarch's historical enterprise. So Caesar's biography, which is considered by many specialists as a masterpiece of humanist writing, poses a certain number of problems. And in particular, writing the life of Caesar means to confront with the Ciceronian accusation of tyranny against Caesar. There again, Petrarch did not depart from his desire for historiographical discernment. He condemns certain actions, such as having turned arms against his country, but he paints the portrait of a man of exceptional virtues. So Petrarch obviously knew the Ciceronian accusations against Caesar, but he doesn't engage in a debate with those accusations. And if we read the text, we notice that the use of terms like tyranny or liberty is very, very parsimonious. It's very, it's by no means systematic. So I chose a sentence which is on the following slide. Pendente tamen obsidione. In this passage, Caesar replies to Lentulus Spinter, who is trying to, who is besieged by Caesar and asks for mercy. And Caesar replies to Lentulus that he is not here to harm anyone. Atquem Caesaris responsu fuit, non se, ut cuiqua male faceret venisse. But to restore the authority of the tribunes of the plebs, and to restore the popular freedom lost because the tyranny of a few. So when he says, sed ut ab inimicorum maleficis atque inuris tueretur, so to protect himself from the actions and of his enemies, but especially ac tribunos plebis sui odio in exilium actos in suam reponere dignitatem, so to give back their dignity to the tribunes of the plebs, denique ut seipsum ac populum Romanum servitio et paucorum tyrannide conculcatum antique rederet libertati, and to give back his liberty, its previous liberty, to the Roman people against the tyranny of the few, paucorum tyrannide. So in this passage, Caesar replies, so the historians, the historian Petrarch here does not necessarily adopt the Caesar's response and Caesar's judgment. He presents it as a historical element which cannot be superimposed on the present. So this is not a judgment from the narrator, a judgment from the historian on the facts he is recounting, but is an historical testimony which can help the reader to reflect on the present. So we can maybe better understand the allegedly anti-popular judgments of Petrarch. Petrarch refuses to enter into the ideological battle of his time, liberty versus tyranny versus freedom. Rather, it sets out to provide heuristic historical displacement. He's trying to give a frame, an historical frame that can that allows a historical displacement to see reality, to see historical and political reality with another system of rules that can be used to understand the present and to act in the present. So in certain sense, Petrarchan enterprise is not contradictory with Barthelot's legal theorization. We can argue about the absence of legal political thought on tyranny in Petrarch that has been often made, but we can also consider that this absence does not prevent the real and profound presence of anti-tyrannical motives in Petrarch's work and in Petrarch's successors. So I would like, in the remaining time, to mention 2 or 3 of Petrarch's successors or disciples. And I will start with Boccaccio and Salutati, that reveal 2 different uses of history in the comprehension of tyranny. So the first is Boccaccio, and I will concentrate on his historical work, the De Casibus Illustrium Virorum by Giovanni Boccaccio. And the second will be the treatise De Tyranno by Coluccio Salutati. So the first, the De Casibus Illustrium Virorum, takes the form of a gigantic series of edifying tales, stories, recounting the fall of illustrious figures. The second, the De Tyranno, is a treatise concerning Dante Alighieri's choice to condemn Caesar's murderers, Brutus and Cassius, in the final circle of his Inferno. So let's start with Boccaccio. The narrator sees a throng of unfortunate characters whose life has been struck by fortune, by bad fortune. And the narrator decides whether or not to write the life, the biography of those figures. So all these characters have in common to have been struck by fortune. More than 50 lives are collected in 9 books, according to a globally chronological scheme. For many critics, this puzzling work does not present the ordinary characteristics of historiographical writing, and this is true. However, the declared ambition, Boccaccio's declared ambition, is indeed to offer a storybook. Its structure and its writing simply reflects the experimental character that Boccaccio gave to all his works. So it's the De Casibus Illustrium Virorum is an experiment. It's a new, it's an attempt to write history in a new way. So what interests me here, more particularly, is that ancient history and contemporary history coexist in the same structure. The last book, the 9th book of the De Casibus Verorum Illustrium, brings the reader to recent events. One of the latter events is the lordship of the Duke of Athens, Gauthier de Brienne, a French aristocrat who was briefly Lord of Florence in 1343. After his brief lordship, he went down in history as a bloodthirsty tyrant, and the Florentine chronicles present him as a warning to all Florentines to be cautious and to avoid avoid tyranny. The structure of the De Casibus implies that certain examples of ancient tyranny or attempts to establish a tyranny are placed alongside contemporary events. So the historian, the narrator, or the historian explicitly encourages the reader to consider, for instance, Marcus Manlius Capitolinus, consul in the 4th century before Christ, as a tyrant, was as a man who attempted to establish a tyranny in the same way as the Duke of Athens. So Boccaccio stages the figure of Gauthier de Brienne using the appearance of Dante Alighieri, Boccaccio's master. And the figure of Dante appears in the book and points out the tyrant, and he orders the narrator to tell his life, to write the biography of this tyrant, of Gauthier de Brienne, in order to enlighten his fellow citizens. So the narrator thus paints a picture of the collective devastation that tyranny is, a picture that recalls both the description of the plague at the beginning of the Decameron, the other masterpiece written in Italian by Boccaccio, and the frescoes of good and bad government in Siena by Ambrogio Lorenzetti. So this is, thank you, the next quotation. And you see that in his passage, you see how the murderous and destructive character of tyranny, vigorously staged, corresponds to the corruption of law, et ad justicendum quivesque terendos tucunet, etc. So in essence, we understand that it is in respect for the law that freedom consists. You have in the sentence abiectam libertatem, gemiscere male cognitam deiectam quo libertatem cepere. So here, historical narration, historiography, and the importance of law to in relation to liberty are more explicitly linked than in Petrarch. If I have a few minutes, I would like to speak about another instance, another example of this link between history, political thought, and importance of law. And it is the treatise by Salutati. De Tyranno, Salutati, as I said before, is an attempt to defend Dante Alighieri and to justify his condemnation of Brutus and Cassius in the last circle of Inferno. And Salutati begins his treatise exactly like Bartolo, with the quotation by Gregorius the Great. But you probably remember that Bartolo said, this is the competence of the jurist, and there is the competence of the theologian. Salutati puts things differently. He said, we have two types of tyranny: a tyranny in habitu, which is interior tyranny, and tyranny in actu, exterior tyranny. But he doesn't separate those two elements. There's not the competence of theologians and the competence of the jurist. One who is the external tyrant is always an internal tyrant, is always a tyrant in himself that exteriorizes his internal tyranny into tyrannical acts. So the political tyrant is a tyrant who acts tyrannically. So it is obvious here that Salutati makes a connection between inner tyranny and outer tyranny. There is a connection for Salutati between what we can call morality and politics. And this link is law. It is the equation between natural law and civil law, a principle that Salutati will forcefully proclaim in many other of his writings. And it seems to me it is because this connection exists that history is useful. It is thus necessary for Salutati in his treatise to examine the motivations of the witnesses. We must examine the testimony of Cicero, which is biased, Salutati says. It is necessary to look at the facts, at the issues. It is necessary to look at the historical context of the end of a Roman Republic to judge actions in the light of the political situation. So history becomes a laboratory for ethical political reflection that transcends ideological issues. Salutati defends the policy in other works of the Republic of Florence, but in this text, he acts as a universal thinker. And I will add just one sentence by way of conclusion. So the moral perspective of the humanists that is often enhanced does not necessarily correspond to an acceptance of the authoritarian evolution of Italian political regimes. This moral perspective is inseparable from the belief that just government means a government which corresponds to justice in accordance with the law is most beneficial to the political, is the most beneficial to the political community. This conviction, this belief, the humanists certainly did not invent it, but they transmitted it to modernity. And this, despite the historical circumstances they went through. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. So does anyone have a question or a comment?
I'm sorry for the English. I do love writing and reading English, but I am not practicing it too much. So sorry for the.
We couldn't tell. Okay. So maybe while others are thinking about possible questions, I want to come back for a moment to Dante and this issue of Brutus and Cassius in hell, as far as I remember, in the mouth of Lucifer himself, along with Judas. So there were the three greatest sinners: Judas, Brutus, and Cassius. However, I mean, how politic? Because clearly, in your presentation, it was treated later as a kind of a political statement by Dante, his support of Caesar, and of course, Dante was the defender of the empire, and he envisaged the ideal constitution as a probably sort of mixed constitution, the Roman Empire restored, and so on. But on the other hand, one of the few pagans who end up not in hell is Cato, who is the protector of the purgatory in Dante. And Cato was, of course, the enemy of Caesar. So how much politics is in the choice of Brutus and Cassius, and how much just the condemnation of treachery, of the betrayal of trust, which could be, well, Judas was also betrayed trust, but it had nothing to do with politics, right? So why later authors felt they had to construe this as a political issue?
Right. This is very, very interesting question. Very interesting question. I think, I'm not sure, but I think that Salutati felt authorized to read the condemnation of Brutus and Cassius and in Inferno as a political statement, but it's a hypothesis. He feels authorized to read it as a political statement because of the existence of Dante's political treatises, because of the existence of the Monarchia, which is a philosophical treatise on the, as you know, of the relationship between the power of the emperor, power of the pope, and which is a very, very important work that we are not sure that Salutati read it, but we know that many people of his time knew the monarchy, and we think, if I'm not mistaken, but specialists have shown that even Petrarch knew the Monarchia. So it is probably the existence of the Monarchia that gave the impulse to read La Commedia and the last cantos of the Inferno in a political way. But I think there is maybe another reason. Maybe that at Salutati's time, Dante, who was a municipal glory, a very important Florentine glory, Dante was needed to elaborate a political thought that would be able to bring themselves the Florentines. I mean that La Commedia, who was commented, who was taught by special appointments at the University of Florence, so which had this public and official dimension. La Commedia should be also so the term in English, but also an encyclopedic text in which one could find elements of reflection and teaching, even if in the political sphere. It's my hypothesis, but you're right. There are many. It's very, very difficult to today. We have this difficulty among Dante specialists of Dante, that some of them do continue to explore this political reading, and some others don't. So it's a very important problem for the interpretation of the Commedia.
Thank you. Any questions or comments? I also wanted to ask you about the sources of those developments, because you mentioned, of course, the jurists as the important authors who dealt with the problem of tyranny in the 14th century. Because from what I remember, so we have this strand coming directly from the jurists from the 12th century, and the Cretalists, of course, that they were commenting on Decretum Gratiani and then the whole system of the Roman law and the canon law, and they were developing, well, the concepts of individual rights and of the state as corporation and all of it. So and Bartolo da Sassoferrato was of course the product and the star of this movement. On the other hand, we have the reception of Aristotle's Politics, right? Because the translation of William Merbeke and the commentary by Aquinas, this is already in circulation. But so those are two ways of approaching the problem of constitution, of tyranny, the limitation of power, and so on. So if I remember correctly, Bartolo da Sassoferrato, he was dissociating himself from the Aristotelian framework. So he was saying, I'm just a jurist, so I'm looking at this totally from a juristic perspective. But of course, I can imagine that Petrarch and Boccaccio and others, they could be familiar with Aristotle. So how much do we know about their knowledge of Aristotle or the use of Aristotle? Because you showed that they were using very much Roman history, right? So Roman history as a case study, and Roman authors. So how about Aristotelian philosophy?
Yes, thank you. I think there is a very interesting history to write, and it would be the history of how those thinkers managed to combine their reading of Aristotelian scholastic sources and their reading of history. I think, for instance, for Salutate, is very, very difficult to. We know that Salutate's sources were juridical, but also we know that Salutatis knew Aristotle, knew Thomas Aquinas, knew Le De Regno and the continuation by Ptolemy of Lucca, so knew Egidio Romano. So we are pretty much well informed about Salutatis' library, and we know that all those works were known to him. And I would say, but I'm not so, I wouldn't be so assertive, but I would say it's pretty much the same thing with Petrarch. But the problem is that the Petrarch is, many works by Petrarch are strongly polemical against the Aristotelian tradition. There is this, so there is this explicit rejection. So it's very difficult to know how much he incorporated the Aristotelian tradition, but probably knew it very well. So the point I would like to make is that the last figure that I had planned to mention, Leonardo Bruni. Leonardo Bruni is the translator of Aristotle. He translated the L'Etica Nicomachea and the Politics into Latin, into a humanistic Latin. And he is, and it was a very important translation offered to the Pope. And he was also the historian and the almost official historian of Florence. So there are those two dimensions of the ethical political thought nourished by the reading of Aristotle and the reading and writing. Salutati did not write any history, but Bruni did. And reading and writing of history, and how those two things correspond. I do think they correspond, but I cannot. I have not demonstrated it. I do think there is a very strong connection between the two. History and writing. The reading and writing history is not disconnected from the moral and ethical meditation based on Aristotelian sources.
Thank you. Christina Bartol.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your lecture. For me, it was very interesting. As I have learned much from this because I'm a Hellenist, so I'm interested completely with other problems. But perhaps my question will be not very stupid. When you was talking about Boccaccio, I started to think about the most famous work, the Decameron. And my question is there any sense to include this very text into our thinking about Boccaccio's thinking about tyranny? Because as far as I remember, after reading this work, I remember that some scholars said that Boccaccio wrote this work in time when the power of the church as the institution was very, very big and very strong. And Boccaccio in this work wanted to say that the civil society also has the power to dominate over some oppressive institutions such as the church. My question is, am I right in this line of interpretation, or it doesn't have any sense?
Thank you very much. It's a very, very interesting question because it is not. It is not usually, and when I say usually, I include myself in this. Usually, we tend to separate our study of the Latin Boccaccio and this scholarly works like the De Casibus and De Mulieribus Claris, and who showed an amazing erudition, and his works in Italian, and in particular the Decameron. So I think it's not. I think it's very relevant to try to think about those works together. So I would say, as a first as a first remark, I would say it's relevant. So now on the question of tyranny, is the Decameron primarily a condemnation of the tyranny of the church? There is undoubtedly strong criticism of the church and strong criticism of the abuse of the church, of the deprivation of the clerks. But this is also a traditional theme of the Italian novella. I would say, but it's only a suggestion. I'm not sure about that. But you know, the last giornata, the last day of the 10 days is the part dedicated to the great virtues. And we have in those novellas, particularly two novellas dedicated to two examples of kings that, so the first is Charles d'Anjou, and the second Carlo d'Anjou and Pietro d'Aragona. And both at certain points ran the risk to act in a tyrannical way, but they are they finally show their magnanimity, but this the Aristotelian virtue, which is enhanced by Boccaccio, those novellas. So I would see the tyrannical theme, the political tyrannical motive specifically in those novellas, but it's just an assumption, just an hypothesis.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.
If I may follow up on that, this is a very interesting topic, because I think that it's the way of interpreting the Middle Ages by the Enlightenment authors. So if you, I think if you read French philosophers of the 18th century, like Condorcet, for instance, who wrote the whole history of the West. So of course, the dominant theme is that the Middle Ages is the period of oppression, that there is no freedom of thought, the church controls everything, which even Condorcet himself says, well, but maybe not entirely, because those people are criticizing the popes. And so I think then later the Marxists emphasized this very much. So I remember I read an introduction to the Polish translation of Aristotle's Politics, which was published in 1953, so during Stalin. And this was, in a way, comical. I was laughing, but then it was very sad, because the whole introduction was this Marxist Leninist interpretation of Aristotle, which had little to do with his actual thought. But this was also this narrative of the liberation from the Middle Ages in the early modern period. So I think to a certain extent, the humanists themselves, they started this, right? They said they rejected the Middle Ages and came back to antiquity. But
yes,
yeah, but in fact, as you said, they say they did it, but when we study them, obviously they knew the scholastic literature very well. So it's easy to say I'm rejecting this while they were very well versed in it. But also the 14th century, I think it's a period of this intense struggle between the Pope and the Emperor and the King of France. And so I don't think that so there was criticism of the power of the Pope, for instance, very much, right? So the tyranny of the Pope, and then the conciliar movement, the limitation of the power of the Pope. But I think, I'm not sure if Laurent agrees with me, but I think Petrarch and Boccaccio and Dante, even if they criticized the church, they felt that they were the church, right? That there is this sense that the church is not something outside they're criticizing. They are criticizing the popes, the bishops, the clergy, various vices and abuses, but not the church as the whole institution, which was, I think, a later phenomenon in the Reformation and the Enlightenment.
Yes, it's very, very, very interesting question. But the most, I mean, blatant example is probably Dante. Dante, who does not hesitate to condemn popes in his fictitious Inferno, but actually he does it. No? And who was an ardent defender of the autonomy of the empire, and against the subordination of the empire to the church, but who was an obvious Christian who defended the nobility, the importance of the church in the destiny of humanity. It's obvious. For Boccaccio, it's very, very, very difficult because we don't have, as in Dante Monarchia or as in the Paradise in the Divine Comedy, this grand exaltation of the Christian faith. We don't have that in Boccaccio's work, so it's more difficult to see it. It's more difficult to observe it. But it is very true for Petrarch, was also a man of faith, and even of Salutati, who had to write the letters to encourage the cities of central Italy to rebel against the church. So he wrote during the war between Florence and the church. Salutati had to write letters to exhort some city-states to rebellion against the church. And even there, we don't have a condemnation of the church. Salutati says it is not a war against the church, it's a war against the legates, against the representatives, against the mercenary troops who says they defend the church, but it is wrong. So there is no open, it's unthinkable, I think, to find in their work and a condemnation of the church in itself, in its as a particular element of God's providential design for humanity. But for Boccaccio and Bruni, it's more difficult to observe it, but it would require further.
Yes, but for instance, in Boccaccio's the Genealogia Deorum Gentilium, he offers allegorical interpretations of pagan myths through Christian lens.
Absolutely.
So this is interesting, but maybe there is no great vision like Dante, but clearly he is not interested in the pagan gods just as pagan gods. He tries to interpret them within Christian framework.
You're right.
So
yes, you're right. Absolutely. And Salutati wrote a work very similar in its inspiration. Absolutely. You're right. Reading ancient pagan authors was considered useful for them precisely because they were veiled, because there were allegorical expressions of universal, intemporal, and Christian truth. You're right, absolutely.
I found it very interesting, the point you made that we shouldn't use the term like the state to describe what was going on in the 14th century. I think we tend to project those early modern concepts back into the Middle Ages. So we speak about the state and the church, while those are later developments. I think it was a period where, well, as I try to say, that the church, it was just, I mean, everyone was in the church, so it was difficult. The same with the state, right? So maybe they were just at the beginning of seeing that the state, like the jurists, for instance, right? They were describing the state as this universitas corporation, which is something different from all the members. So the idea of the abstract state was emerging from the jurists, but it wasn't widespread. And so I think it's important to remember that those categories are not always useful, right? In thinking about this.
Absolutely. And when you say that they were aware that everyone was the church, you're absolutely right. Even the Monarchia by Dante, which can be considered as a strong statement in favor of the empire against the church, but the Monarchia says that human being is composed of soul and body, and as for the body is ruled by law and the emperor, and the soul must be ruled by the church. So there is a distinction, but the distinction is within the individual. So we don't have two heterogeneous and spheres. They superimpose themselves.
Maybe we have time for one more question, if there is any. Oh, Robert Marix. So the last question. Robert, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. We
Yes,
cannot
okay,
see
cool.
you, but we
Right.
can hear you.
All right, sorry. All right, very quick question. Obviously, the common denomination of the authors that you discuss is Florence or Tuscany, right?
Right.
So my question is, have you done any comparative work with political thinkers, writers of other Italian forms of, because obviously Italy is not Italy in that period, but so I was wondering if we think of similar, obviously, political constitution, do we have any as early Venetian writers, for example, because obviously probably more known are from 16th, early 17th centuries, but do we have any parallel to Florentine writers that could be of interest for your topic?
Yes, you're absolutely right. I should have given a different title, because my research is mainly based on Florentine tradition, because one of the topic that I try to study is the existence, is the very nature of this Florentine tradition that ends in Machiavelli. So my work is focused on Florence for that reason. But you're absolutely right. Florence is not Italy, even if it is a very important cultural and political center of Italy at that time. But we do have humanists, very numerous and important humanists in the Venetian area that have been studied by a French colleague. We have humanists in Milan, in very city of Milan, that is labeled by Florentine as a tyranny. We have also a very rich Milanese humanism, and Rome is also, especially after the return of the Pope in Italy after the Council of Constance, and even before, actually, Rome is another very important center. So yes, you're absolutely right. And there's one thing we can add, is that all those thinkers and humanists, and it has been shown by a recent book on the humanists and the papal curia, all those humanists formed intertwined spheres that ultimately constitute a network. So it is very important to bear that in mind, and to deepen this comparative approach that you mentioned.
A sort of a republic of political letters, isn't it?
Sorry?
A kind of a republic of political letters.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So we have to wrap up this interesting discussion. So thank you once more, Laurent, for the excellent presentation. I thank all for being here, participating in this lecture. And in 2 weeks, on the 26th, we have a panel discussion which will conclude this academic year. And I can already announce that we got a grant for the next year, where we start with Machiavelli and the 16th century authors. So the story will be continued. But for now, we have to end. So I wish you very good evening, and see you.
Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.